Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us today. My name is Gregory Ormsby-Maury. I'm the Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri. This is the Agroforestry in Action webinar series, held approximately monthly, usually Wednesdays around this time. We try to showcase compelling or great work in agroforestry, both here in the United States and from around the world. Sometimes some of the latest and greatest in agroforestry research and practice. Our speaker today is Andrew Miccolis. He is the country coordinator from ECRAF Brazil, at the World Agroforestry Center's program in Brazil. The presentation will run around 40 to 45 minutes, after which we'll follow it with maybe 10, 15 minutes of questions, and we'll have a dialogue box, which the participants, you can enter some questions and present to Andrew. So again, our speaker today is Andrew Miccolis. He's the country coordinator for the World Agroforestry Center, that's ECRAF, in Brazil. He specializes in agroecology and participatory natural resource management. For the past 20 years, he has worked in Brazil on sustainable development project planning and evaluation and training of smallholder farmers and extension agents in agroforestry and permaculture systems. As coordinator of ECRAF Brazil, he leads agroforestry-based initiatives to diversify oil palm production systems, sustainable biofuels, and forest restoration in the context of smallholders. He is also the co-founder of what's called Instituto Salvia, an NGO that focuses on socio-environmental technologies, and through which he has coordinated numerous projects on climate change adaptation, agroforestry, and a range of land use planning activities. He's based in the office there in Belém. I think today you're speaking to us from Brasilia, the capital city. Andrew is a citizen of both Brazil and the United States, and today he's going to talk to us about oil palm agroforestry system in general. The presentation is titled Upscaling Sustainable Oil Palm Agroforestry Systems, Lessons from Brazil. So, Andrew, please.
Hi, hello, good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? I hope you can. So first of all, I'd like to thank Gregory and the University of Missouri for the invitation to speak to you today. And hopefully the idea is to put some ideas out there for a little discussion towards the end too. So I very much welcome any doubts or questions you might have. Let me go down here. Okay. So first, before I begin, I would like to quickly acknowledge some of the key partners, institutions that have been behind the experiments I'll be showing. This is a project called D&D project. D&D in Portuguese means oil palm, from the African origin. So the main partners involved in this project up until now, since 2008, since its inception, have been Natura, which is a major cosmetics company in Brazil, Canta, which is a farmers cooperative. It's an agroforestry, mostly agroforestry farmers cooperative in Pará State, and Embrapa, which is the National Agricultural Research Corporation or Institute in Brazil, and FINEP, which is a funding agency that funds projects and put in some of the funding for the initial experiments that Natura has been leading. But just to say very quickly that these experiments are really pioneering research. As far as we know, there's nothing similar to them on a commercial scale and with scientific studies at this level anywhere in the world. And so I'd just like to say that Natura and these other partners that I've mentioned have been really key to breaking new ground in oil palm agroforestry research. And also a quick disclaimer is that ECRAF is only now actually getting formally involved in this project, although as a consultant I worked in these experiments in this project in the first few years especially. But now with my hat as ECRAF, we are, and ECRAF as an institution is only now getting formally involved in this through a project that I'll tell you more about later, but it's a project funded by USAID, and that's basically about what we're talking about here today, which is about upscaling oil palm agroforestry systems. So a quick overview, I'm going to quickly go over the global context and then some of the key arguments behind using agroforestry systems with oil palm, the arguments behind intercropping. And then we'll actually look at, can they be intercropped? Is it feasible to do so? And then challenges for upscaling. I hope to spend most of my presentation on that, on the challenges and actually how to gain scale based on our experience in this project and based on our wider experience with agroforestry systems as a whole in Brazil and elsewhere. So just quickly about the global context, for those who don't know much about oil palm, it's the most consumed vegetable oil in the world. It beats, a few years ago, it actually surpassed soybeans. Most people don't know this because it's hidden in a lot of foods, processed foods that are consumed, such as margarine. Oftentimes, when you see vegetable oil or there's other names for it on labels that is actually referring to palm oil. Especially when it says no trans fat, you can pretty much bet that there's palm oil in it. So it's kind of hidden, but it's very ubiquitous in the food industry as well as in the cosmetics industry. It's very widely used, which is one of the main reasons that Natura became involved in this project in the first place, which is really to test truly sustainable systems. And so the main advantage, of course, and why it's being planted so widely is because of the high yields and high potential for returns on the investment. That's one of the main reasons that has attracted key players globally, including in Brazil, to get involved with these systems historically. So, despite these high returns, oil palm has gotten a pretty bad reputation. Actually, oil palm that has, especially because of the deforestation in Indonesia and Malaysia, because it's associated with loss of habitat, especially orangutans, have become sort of the poster boy for the anti-oil palm campaigns, most notably Greenpeace and WWF. And other NGOs based in Europe Conservation International, others have strong campaigns to avoid deforestation as a result of new plantations, especially in these countries. But it's worth noting that deforestation is going on elsewhere on the new frontier of oil palm, both in West Africa and in some parts of Latin America, and to a smaller extent in Brazil as well. Just like like to underscore, as an environmental impact, contamination of waterways, this is something we see going on in Brazil. This is well documented in other places as well as the impacts of fires in Indonesia, which is a pretty widespread clearing practice. Well, besides that, just to say quickly that although it's predominant in these two countries, it is expanding elsewhere, especially in Africa and in some certain parts of Latin America, Peru, Colombia, and also in Brazil. So just a really quick history of oil palm in Brazil. Up until relatively recently, it was very, very small hectares or the amount of area of oil palm being grown in Brazil. It was pretty restricted to just a few companies, half of which was concentrated in the Amazon in the state of Pará, and about the other half concentrated in the states of Bahia, which were much more smallholder type systems. So most of the companies were actually concentrated in these two states, but not something that anybody really heard about in Brazil up until 2010, when a series of different factors actually, but a new oil palm, what they call sustainable oil palm development policy, was put into place in Brazil by then President Lula, which really encouraged the expansion of oil palm, especially by some major companies, major players, including Vale, the mining company, Petrobras, the oil giant in Brazil, particularly because this was associated with the energy policy, the biodiesel policy. And then we had ADM also setting up shop, as well as a few other major companies, pretty much in the back of the incentives that the government set up for the companies to be able to expand. These incentives basically said that you have to work with smallholders if you want to have access to lower tax rates and to more favorable conditions for credit. Um, so this really spurred the expansion in Brazil. After 2014, however, the recession in Brazil, the political crisis, as well as the plummeting palm oil prices in the world market, led a lot of companies to pull out of or to really freeze their operations. So we really see over the last 6 years, really, an amazing sort of 2 or 3 year period of boom and a period of what you might call bust that we're facing right now. From expansion, we really went to a contraction period over the last couple of years. So what are the main risks associated with expanding oil palm in Brazil based on some of the work we've done in that region? First is the dependency on monoculture. A lot of the farmers in this region went through the whole boom and bust cycle of black pepper. They know what it's like to, especially the Japanese, the descendants that are very prevalent in that region. They know what it's like to face market busts, as well as other factors such as disease, fusarium, and other factors that led them to really go bust with the black pepper. So a lot of the farmers are aware of these risks and are really reticent to adopt monocrop systems in that region for this very reason. The other perceived risk among farmers, among smallholders in Brazil at least, is that the package, the 6 to 10 hectare technological package that's really being touted and I would say even being required by most of the companies is it mobilizes most of the available labor and land that the farmers have. When I say available land, a lot of these farmers have 20, 25. The smallholders, they might have 20, 25 hectares. But if you leave aside the legal reserve or environmental conservation set-asides, then and plus the riparian zones and all that, it doesn't leave much land left for oil palm. That's one factor. The other factor is it's actually a question mark. The evidence is still, there's different evidence on this, but there is some clear evidence showing that farmers that adopt these 6 to 10 hectare systems can be undermined as far as producing other foodstuffs such as cassava, which is a real staple in the region. If both their labor and land is mobilized, they sometimes find it hard to be able to keep on planting other short cycle food crops that they used to plant, just because they simply don't have enough time when all is said and done after managing the oil palm. And the other perceived risk is the high cost, high initial investment costs for high, at least for the farmers, considered very, very high, at least for the farmers in the region. So anywhere between $2,000 to $3,000 for initial establishment costs for the first couple of years per hectare. It's pretty high compared to other land uses in the region. Sorry, can you? Alô? Pode parar de bater aí. Para de bater, por favor. Tá, para de bater, por favor. Pode parar. Hello? Hello? I hope you can still hear me.
Yeah,
can everybody still hear me? Okay, sorry.
No faz mal.
Okay, no problem. Where was I? So somebody was making a lot of noise nearby, so I had to ask them to stop making the noise. And you have to also excuse the birds here for making a little bit of background noise too, but hopefully that won't get in the way. So monocrop versus oil palm, agroforestry oil palm. What are the main arguments for both sides? What is the future of oil palm in the Amazon? Is it monocrop and even elsewhere, or is it agroforestry based systems? Well, and the main question is, especially when this work with Natura and other partners began back in 2007, 2008, was, is it possible to intercrop oil palm with agroforestry systems? So is the conventional wisdom actually wise about this? And the conventional wisdom says, or used to say at least, that it wouldn't be possible because of competition, both for light and nutrients and for space. And some of the researchers involved in this initially said that competition would be too great, both for the oil palm and for other crops, especially because of the very vigorous root system that the oil palm has, because of the high degree of shading that it has. You know, everyone pretty much in the beginning was saying, back in 2006 and 7, saying, no, this is not possible for all these reasons. So the research led, as I said before, led by Natura and Embrapa in partnership with Kanta, that began back in 2007 and 8, has basically shown that it is possible to intercrop. These are some pictures from year 7 of these systems, and you can see the oil palm sort of in the background, or on your left and right in the top picture, and then sort of in the background in the bottom picture. So basically, the conclusion is that this conventional wisdom, as I was saying, really wasn't. It was definitely conventional, but really not that wise about whether it's possible or not. And so, just to give you a quick overview of what these systems actually are comprised of. Basically, annual crops in the beginning. I don't think anybody disputes that when you have a spacing of 8 or 8.5 meters between plants, that you can actually have short cycle crops in the first 3 or 4 years. This is a very common practice, also in Malaysia and to a certain extent in Indonesia and even in Colombia. There are a lot of farmers use that available space as the oil palm is growing to plant these short cycle crops. And then, but in these systems, besides the short cycle crops and leguminous crops as well, what we call the fertilizer species, we also have some fruit trees and cash crops such as cacao, cocoa, acai, which is a native Brazilian palm, banana bacaba, which is also another native Amazonian palm, and then black pepper, a few other lianas, and then some timber species. So the main characteristic of these systems is very, very intense management. That's slash and mulch. I'll talk more about that later. And also they're 100% organic. Well, I'll say almost 100%. There's a little bit of use on a very, very small piece of herbicide in initial establishment, but because the farmer really wanted to test that. But besides that, there's no chemical inputs whatsoever in these systems over the years. I already talked about the partners, the main partners behind this Dende project. And so this project set up 3 6-hectare plots planted in 2008 in this region of Tomé Sul. And the sort of overarching goal of this project is not just to show that it's economically feasible to intercrop, but especially to show that it's possible to reconcile conservation goals, biodiversity, carbon, and other conservation-oriented goals with livelihoods and the economic. That there are trade-offs, of course, but it is possible to balance these trade-offs. This was sort of the initial hypothesis of this research that overall has pretty much shown to be a valid one. So a little more details on the species. I think I'll go over this quickly. If you have any questions towards the end, I can answer them about the species. As I said, a few palm trees here. Let me pull up the arrow. A few palm trees There we go. So we have a few palm trees here. We have the hardwoods here, and then oilseed, a native leguminous, long cycle leguminous tree, a few fertilizer species, leguminous, besides the sunflower, the Mexican sunflower Titonia, which actually uh, turned out to be one of the most efficient crops as far as nutrient cycling is concerned. And then bananas and some more leguminous crops, cassava, glycidia, and inga. This is the basic layout of the systems. A row in the middle with the taller trees, and then alternate rows on the to both sides with what we call the fertilizer species, the banana and other fertilizer species, and then a row of, here we also have the cacao and the acai here, and then a row relatively close to the oil palm here with the species that are used for slashing and mulching. Glycidia, inga. This varies according to the plots and the treatments, but it's mostly inga, and the glycidia and the titonia. And then the double rows of oil palm here with initially the bananas, and then now just the cacao, the cocoa left in between the plants of oil palm. This in itself is quite innovative because there's, up until very recently, at least very few examples in the world of actually intercropping in the same rows, cacao and bananas in the same rows as the oil palm. Okay, so why agroforestry systems? Well, in a nutshell, because they really are important to reconcile sort of the social benefits with the economic and the environmental benefits. There's a lot of literature on this. I won't dwell too much on it, on the environmental services and functions, and most of it has been proven in these experiments led by Natura and company. So nutrient cycling, soil conservation, both for climate change mitigation, you'll see the data on the carbon I'll show you in a second, and also for adaptation. These experiments in Tomeasu have shown the systems to be more resilient to extreme events, especially a very prolonged drought that we saw last year, especially in this year, which in the region as a whole has a very pronounced effect on yields. In these systems, the yields have actually stayed higher than throughout. This is what we've been hearing from farmers, some of the farmers involved in these systems. So they're actually managing to deal with these climate extreme events much better than other agroforestry systems. And why? Basically because these systems are generally higher, richer in biodiversity. They're more biodiverse systems than most of the agroforestry systems, the more, let's call them, conventional agroforestry systems in the region, which are usually limited to just a few species. These systems are much higher in biodiversity and therefore more resilient, not only to climate but also to disease and other factors. So just very quickly, some of the data on carbon for those who haven't seen any of this data before, just basically showing that the oil palm agroforestry systems are either equivalent or even superior or even better than the adjacent secondary growth systems as far as soil carbon is concerned. So this in itself is very key data from a climate perspective, that these systems can actually store more carbon. The agroforestry systems can actually store more carbon than both conventional agroforestry systems and than the conventional monocrop systems. So here we have a study that was done by Natura with Conservation International using true cost to show the environmental services. Again, as you can see here in the graphs, the various services of the agroforestry oil pump systems are substantially higher than the monocrop oil pump systems. And then the economic advantages, the high yields. The yields currently in the system are, I'm not going to go over the specific data here. Some of it's still unpublished, but the yields in the oil palm agroforestry systems are equivalent to or significantly higher than the monocrop yield, that is per plant. So we're talking about 30 to 40% higher per plant, which per hectare means an equivalent yield just for the oil palm. And then we have high yields of cocoa as well. And like I said, resilience to climate change also means higher yields in times of extreme events, especially the droughts. And just to note that these estimates generally are very, very conservative, and don't take into account some of the other products that will still be reaped from these systems. On the other hand, from an economic standpoint, these systems do have very high initial investment costs, and they are very intensive in labor. Of course, the initial investment costs can be generally should be offset by the production, but the labor intensive just means it can be a good thing, of course, if you're talking about smallholders, but oftentimes smallholders don't have enough labor to be able to manage the systems on such a large scale, to do all the management practices. So this can be a disadvantage if you don't size up the systems in accordance with the actual capacity of the smallholders to manage them. So now going on to challenges on pretty much the second part of this presentation. First, to just quickly go over the main challenges. And first, a lot of these challenges about expanding more sustainable or more biodiverse oil palm, or that is agroforestry systems with oil palm, are similar to most of the challenges faced in upscaling agroforestry systems as a whole. And there's a lot of work has been done on this in the literature, but I just want to go over some of the key constraints. Also, I'd like to quickly recognize that some of this work on the constraints and on this methodological approach is from a project supported by IUCN, that we're looking at upscaling agroforestry systems and looking at different options for different contexts. This is also in partnership with Embrapa and a few other national NGOs and institutions. So first, I think the overarching challenge to gaining scale, really, it's about designing options through participatory approaches that are geared toward different contexts. So there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and I think this is something recognized within ECRAF and by many others working on this, on agroforestry and other sustainable land systems, that you really need to tailor the technological options, the governance, the policy, and all of that to different contexts. And when we say context, we don't mean just biophysical context, not just edapho-climatic, not just soils and climate and your usual sort of biophysical analysis, but also the social context, the policy context. And so what we're developing in this approach, this options by context approach, is really first trying to understand different levels of access to different resources. So what are the main constraints in each context? And this is the first step we need to take. And of course, beginning with the farmer, what are the farmer's main objectives and strategies? What access do they have to knowledge, to labor, as I said before, to planting materials, the germplasm, and also access to governance, to policies, and to markets, and to equitable business models. So now I'm going to go over each of these main constraints that vary, as I said, according to context, but that generally can be found in pretty much any context. So their level varies, the composition varies, but generally the constraints seem to be more or less the same. So first, about farmer objectives. First, we need to understand really what does the farmer want. The success of the system is directly proportionate to the extent to which it meets farmer objectives, and to really the extent to which it helps farmers to achieve their dreams ultimately, because this will determine the extent to which they'll be committed to managing the systems, to implementing them, and to keeping them, to really investing their time and energy in the systems over time. So that's why it's key to first raise this and then try to design the systems accordingly. Second, are the farmers interested in more? Are they more interested in production and economic gain, or are they more interested in conservation-oriented goals, or do they want both? Is it on a sort of conservation set-aside that they're planting? Are they interested in restoring degraded lands using oil palm and other plants? So all this really determines what kind of systems we need to design. And then we also need to look not just at the aspirations and dreams and objectives of the man or of the main farmer we're talking to, but also of the whole family, because as we know, this is key, both the women and the youth, this is key to ensuring that the systems are sustainable over time, that the rest of the family also feels like their objectives are being met, and thus they'll be more involved in the systems. And then we need to look at, okay, can these objectives be achieved in the biophysical, given the biophysical constraints and given the other policy constraints, which I'll mention now. And what's missing for them to be able to achieve their objectives? So, like I said, regarding the systems, these are ways to overcome some of the challenges from a systems perspective, really at a plot level. First, like I said before, there is no one-size-fits-all model. We prefer to call them options, because options are general, they're generic in structure, enough in structure to be able to be widely adopted, but also flexible enough to be adapted to different contexts. So if you have the basic structure but can tweak the species selection, the design elements, the management practices to tailor the system to that context, then there's a much greater chance that they'll be successful. This is more or less what we tried to do in the beginning of the experiments that I showed before, which is really looking at how to reconcile farmer objectives with the company's objectives, with the research objectives in the systems. But especially the farmer objectives, because if you don't have that, then you won't have anything else. And then this may sound sort of obvious, but the systems, they need to be simple enough to be able to be managed by the farmers, but also complex enough to meet the other functions that they need to meet, the fertilization functions, the environmental services, the environmental functions, such as nutrient cycling, such as shade, appropriate shading. So it's really about, if I had to really summarize from a systems perspective, I would really say that it's about finding a balance between simplicity and complexity with regard to functions and capacity for management that the farmers have. Not only capacity as far as time, as far as availability of labor, but also capacity as far as knowledge. So if the management practices are too complex, that they require too much training, then it definitely might raise eyebrows, something to look at. And then another more technical detail about the systems design is making sure that you have fertilizer species throughout the different successional groups. And when I say successional, I don't mean you're just classic forest succession, but agroforestry successional groups. So in the first few years, we have all leguminous and in some cases grass species. And then generally what tends to happen is a dip after the 5th or 7th year, because you've used the initial fertilizer species, but sometimes there might not be enough tree fertilizer species. So there might not be tree fertilizer species to keep these functions going on over time, to keep fertilization going on over time, because one of the goals of these systems is to provide as much fertilization on site or very close to the site as possible. And the only way of doing that is making sure that you keep this function going on through key species after the 5th and 7th year to the 10th and 15th and 20th year of production. And then also how to really optimize the use of locally available resources for nutrients. So sometimes that means adopting live fences or alleys or hedges around the systems or within the systems, so that you can not only have windbreaks but also use those nutrients for heavy-duty slashing and mulching. This is, I would say, the main challenge is ensuring that you have intensive management, that your management will ultimately result in keeping high yields over time. And the way of doing that is slash and mulch, is using the leguminous crops, the Titonia, Glidicidia, and other crops more in the first 5 to 10 years, and then using other trees, leguminous trees and other trees, even some of the hardwoods, for their biomass, and really manage them intensively over time. So, and then we have the whole issue of agroecological practices. As I mentioned, the experiments led by Natura and Brapa Encanta are 100% agroecological. There is no chemical inputs whatsoever. So in order to keep these systems productive, you really need to adopt basic agroecological practices and principles. As I said, live fencing, windbreaks, using your resources, locally available resources, including the residues from the production itself. That means the empty fresh fruit bunches from the oil palm once they've been harvested, and any other residues you might have on site or in the immediate surroundings. These need to really be optimized. And so, yes, sometimes you do import inputs, but you import them not from very far. You import them just from your adjacent areas, if need be, or from any other residues that might be available locally, such as acai husks or other coconut husks, or other residues from fruit production, from fruit extraction, and so on. So I'm reaching the end here. I think I'm pretty much within my time. Access to knowledge, again, is another key constraint. And how to overcome this constraint, it's about processes, about building horizontal capacity building processes. That is, farmer-to-farmer training. Of course, it's important, it's key, I would say, to always involve technicians and researchers, but to ensure that everybody is at the same level. That's why we say horizontal. It's not just farmer to farmer, but also farmer to technician, farmer to research, research to farmer, and then with some vertical connections, of course, but generally trying to horizontalize these processes as much as possible. This is what seems to work. Forgot my arrow. Here we go. And then the other factor I would underscore about access to knowledge is really learn by doing and seeing. It's not enough to just go and train farmers, even if it's by a farmer. It's really farmers change their practices, and technicians as well change their practices, especially when they are personally involved in setting up a system or visit a system that's already been set up by another farmer. So it's both doing and seeing, doing in practice and seeing. That's really what works about for increasing access to the type of knowledge that the farmers need to have to be able to manage these complex systems. So if they're more complex, then generally they also require more planning. They require participatory design to be able to take into account all the other factors I mentioned before, which is access to labor, access to markets, access to germplasm, you name it. So if you want, one example of this is that if you want to implement more complex systems, as these systems you're seeing on your right-hand side, which are the oil palm agroforestry systems, then you need to plan ahead of time, because sometimes you can't find the seedlings you need at the right time of year. You need to either produce them beforehand, or you need to plan to actually harvest the seeds, and then do direct sowing of seeds, or the cuttings if you're working with cuttings. So generally we try to adopt a sort of a two-step capacity building system. One which is about observation in the field and about planning and co-designing systems with the farmers, and then the second step is about implementing and doing it in practice and then learning from that. And then access to labor, also a huge constraint. I would say probably one of the biggest constraints in any agroforestry systems, but also proven to be somewhat of a constraint in these systems. When you're talking about 5 to 6 hectare plots, that's a huge area for smallholders to implement all at once. So one of the sort of suggestions for upscaling systems among farmers that are more typical of the region, of that region in the Amazon, and more typical of other regions as well, is about reducing the plot size, beginning with smaller systems. This is what we hope to do in the project that we're just beginning, that eCraft is just beginning now with these same partners, which is about working with smaller plots, half a hectare to 1 hectare per year. That's already a lot for relatively complex agroforestry systems, and given the labor constraints that most of these farmers have. They also have other duties. They also need to tend to the cassava. They need to tend to their acai. But if we can join the cassava and the acai and other crops on the same plots, then that optimizes not only their labor but also their available land. And again, we need to select our species according to labor capacity, not only to the volume of labor available, per day, per month, or per year, but also to the knowledge that the farmers have. It's no use wanting to ask an old couple to climb trees, to coppice those trees, or to prune them intensively, if they don't have the physical conditions to do so. Of course, there are some old couples that beat others and can still do that, but generally speaking, that's not the case. So that's just one example of why we need to select our species and our management practices according to the availability and to the quality and capacity of the labor that the farmers might have. And this varies not only from community to community, it varies from family to family, and can vary, usually does vary significantly over time. So as a young person goes off to school, well, then the older people have to manage the systems, and then you need to think about that as well. And then I already talked about optimizing labor through management practices. This is one of the advantages, of course, of agroforestry systems, but it's really even more important in these systems, because in the oil palm systems, because you really need to plan in a way that you're reducing the overall cost of labor, so that when you're clearing or weeding for the cassava, you're also weeding for another crop as well. And then, like I said, the labor demands change over time. And then access to germplasm. I think this is almost my last slide. Access to germplasm. Basically, as I said, one of the biggest challenges is having the amount and the variety of seedlings, seeds, and cuttings that we need to plant at the right time of year, all in your hands at once. This is a huge challenge, and the main way of overcoming this challenge is planning ahead, as I said, and investing time and energy not only in producing seedlings, but also in harvesting seeds and then collecting cuttings nearby. So it's about prior planning, and it's about also changing practices. About a lot of farmers are just used to getting their seedlings somewhere and planting those, but we need to invest a lot more time and energy in actually getting the farmers and technicians to harvest seeds and to produce their own seedlings and to actually plant seeds directly, to sow seeds directly in the field. Sometimes can be much more cost effective than planting seedlings. And then again, identifying good mother trees that but not only good mother trees, but also a variety of trees within the same landscape to ensure genetic variability, to ensure greater resilience and adaptation to climate change and disease and other factors. This is key in gathering and collecting your planting materials. I already talked about the logistics. And then just quickly again, trying to size up what's most cost effective, planting by seedling, by seed, or by cutting. Sometimes it can be a combination of these. Sometimes it can be just one or two of these techniques. And lastly, access to policies, which is of course a constraint anywhere we go. What varies is what policies. In some places, it's land tenure policies. In the Brazilian Amazon, it's much more about access to rural credit policies. There are lines of credit for agroforestry and agroecological systems, but they're not really accessed enough. And there's a series of obstacles for smallholders to access these systems, part of which is the high degree of complexity and the lack of technical and financial coefficients, ratios, that is, for the banks to feel much safer and more trusting in these systems. So a lot of research still needs to be done on this, but this is one of the things we're doing. Another project in Brazil is looking at economic feasibility and trying to really provide the local managers, but also the wider policymakers, with the basic data on the oil palm agroforestry systems, on their feasibility, and on their return on investments over time, and on other factors as well, on other economic factors. Again, another aspect is rural extension of the policies that we need to look at. Generally speaking, they don't speak the same language as we're speaking about more complex intercrop systems. They're used to simpler systems, simpler projects, which are easier to approve, easier to write, easier to approve. So it really entails also bringing about a sort of a change of attitude in the rural extension services, but also not only in how they work, but also in how they work with farmers and helping them to do co-design and the sort of horizontal capacity building I was mentioning before. Ultimately, all of this could be maybe summarized as research in development. This is the research that we're really investing a lot of energy in eCraft, which is seeing how the research can be applied, not only applied research, but how it can be embedded within and an integral part of sort of mainstream development activities and policies. So how can we be a part of these activities? How can research be a part of them? Not just try to influence them from outside, but also be a part of them, learn from them, and be and sort of helping to influence the mainstream policies by being an integral part of them. And then lastly, equitable business practices. There's a very nice paper, if anyone hasn't seen it yet, that I recommend you read by Brandão and Schoenfeld, a recent paper supported by C4. I don't know if that's big enough you can read it, but you'll have access to the presentation afterwards, which really goes over this whole conundrum of sharing onuses and bonuses, and sharing rewards, but also sharing the brunt of risks stemming from these systems, because there are risks, as I mentioned before. So to me, in the business models, we really need to be about sharing these risks. The contracts, the agreements between the farmers and the companies need to distribute these risks better. And they also need to allow for intercropping. Some of the companies in Brazil simply won't accept intercropping unless if it's just in the very beginning. And even the very beginning, some of them seem to be very resistant to allowing, say, planting cassava or other crops, because they think that it will detract from, that it'll be sort of stealing inputs from the oil palm, that is nutrients, labor, and other inputs from the oil palm. So they're kind of against it. So the business models need to take into account livelihoods, and to do so, they need to really allow for intercropping and allow for taking into account the farmer needs and objectives, as I said before. So a few quick takeaways. I think I'm just past my time here, my 45 minutes, 50 minutes. Few takeaways. First is that the oil palm agroforestry system, it's pretty much proven, I would say, by these experiments that some which I've shown in this presentation, that that the oil palm agroforestry can reconcile the environmental and social goals on the same plot. And this in itself, I think, is really groundbreaking work. It's very groundbreaking conclusions. To what extent you'll reconcile, to what extent you'll go more to one side, more to the economic side, uh, more to the environmental, more to the social side, really depends on your species selection, on the composition, and especially I'd say in your management practices, how you manage the trees over time in these relatively high density systems will determine to what extent you'll have higher yields or more carbon or more biodiversity depending on how things go. And then again, I would highlight the importance of tailoring these solutions, not wanting to just copy these systems that have been shown to be successful, but also tailoring solutions to different contexts according to all those issues already mentioned, especially taking into account the different constraints and trying to address those constraints in your species selection systems design and management practices. And then again, about training and about knowledge, it's the need. If you want to upscale, then farmers really need to see it working and need to do it in practice. So we really need to invest a lot on training farmers and on building their capacity, because they're ultimately the ones that will take this forward, not the researchers or the technicians who are more fleeting, passing in the landscape, if you will. And then you also need to create a sort of enabling policy environment. I think that pretty much wraps it up for now, so I'd like to thank you all for attending, and if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to entertain them now.
Well, thank you, Andrew. That's a very good presentation. We have some time for some discussion and questions. I'm gonna, yeah, that was really quite an excellent presentation, quite comprehensive. We have, as I said, time for questions and some discussions. I'm going to open up a dialogue box here for participants to enter in some questions. I can hear my microphone echoing back a bit. But while some of the questions are starting to come in, maybe I'll present one question to Andrew. I've heard and read in the past that there's, at least in principle, on paper, some positive policies and a commitment to sustainability on the part of the Brazilian authorities, and policies that, for example, would limit oil palm expansion to only degraded or certain types of land, prevent more clearing or deforestation for oil palm development. But in practice, in reality, how is that playing out, and how is it working? There must be pressure if the markets are expanding and there's good prices. There must be pressure both in large and small interests to expand, and that must somehow translate into conversion and clearing. What's the situation with that in Brazil?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that in the beginning, there's some reports that we heard of, although there isn't that much scientific evidence on this. There's some reports of more anecdotal, but some reports of clearing of primary forests and older secondary forests for establishment of new plots. Although, as you said, the Brazilian policy says you can only plant on degraded lands, and the companies maybe had very good intentions in this regard. Sometimes the reality of the governance is that some of this is outsourced. There are third-party contractors involved in establishment, so it's difficult to really control what's actually done in practice, sort of in the field. So I think most of the initial concerns have been about clearing of primary or older secondary forests have been addressed. There is some evidence that there's still some degree of clearing going on, but generally I would say yes. Most of the expansion has been on pastures or other degraded land. The difficulty, of course, is defining what degraded land actually is. There is a definition in the law and the policy that says land that was cleared up until 2008. That's the cutoff point. But of course, growth rates vary a lot depending on the municipality, so it's difficult to measure what degraded land is, to what extent is it degraded, to what extent is it regeneration, is it secondary growth. So that's kind of a huge challenge, I would say, in actually enforcing the law. But generally speaking, I think, yeah, there's been compliance with this policy.
Well, that's good news, and thanks for that update. I see one question coming in now. We do have time for more, so in the meantime, maybe I'll ask one follow-up on and how to keep the focus on small holders. And it would seem that in order for market forces not to shift things to consolidation to a larger and larger plantation type of development for oil palm, that there would need to be some emphasis on developing the harvesting efficiencies in the harvesting, aggregation, and these initial processing to allow the smallholders and aggregation to be competitive and efficient versus larger plantations, even if they're competitive on yields.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. In Brazil, almost all of the farmers involved with oil palm are linked up to the companies in one way or another. There are different types of agreements, but pretty much all of them really depend on the companies because there isn't a more small-scale processing capacity in Brazil. This is really different from the scenario in Peru, for example, where a lot of aid was given directly to farmers through sort of cocoa eradication, alternatives to cocoa programs. A lot of aid was given to farmers who set up cooperatives, including processing cooperatives. So that really took a lot of the power out of the big companies. In Brazil, however, that isn't the case. So a huge challenge, which I didn't mention here, I probably should have, is developing more small-scale processing equipment, processing plants that are more suited to the reality and to the scale of smallholders. I think this would be really revolutionary in loosening the grip that some of the companies have on the smallholders. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, yeah, it puts it in context, and thanks for addressing that. There is one question that's come in from Arjuna Pereira, and who asks about are you inserting the agroforestry configuration under standard planting distances of oil palm, or is the distance increased between oil palms? How does this impact the yield of oil palm?
That's a good question.
Yes.
Yeah, well, in these systems, these experiments, the double rows of oil palm are in conventional spacing, which is around 8.5 meters between plants, anywhere between 8 and 9 meters between plants. That's pretty much conventional spacing in the double rows. But the rows of agroforestry vary between, in these experiments, they vary from 15 to 21 meters. So per hectare, you have much less plants, anywhere between 85 and 100 plants in these systems of oil palm, as compared to 140 or so, 142 or 3 plants in conventional systems. So yes, despite this difference in plants per hectare, the yields in the systems are actually similar. The agroforestry oil palm, the oil palm in the agroforestry systems, though there's around 30 to 40% less plants per hectare, the overall yields per hectare are actually similar to monocrop systems. In other words, the yields per plant are 30 to 40% higher than the yields in monocrop systems in these experiments.
Right. Okay.
Hello?
There are not too many other questions in yet. There is a question in the chat box from Sarah Sachs, who asks, could you speak to, it's kind of a related question to what we just talked about with the aggregation and processing infrastructure. She asks, could you speak to the organization between smallholders and oil palm extractors and refineries, and how, if at all, these can be integrated into supporting oil palm agroforestry?
Yeah, like I said, in Brazil, that's also a very good question. In Brazil, um, there isn't a direct relationship at all between the smallholders and the actual processing. They sell to the companies, then the companies have their own plants and do their own processing.
Mm.
So, um, in my view, this is a huge bottleneck, a huge challenge for adding value and really making these systems more sustainable. Even some of the farmers in Tomeasu, especially the Japanese farmers of Japanese descent, that is farmers, they um, aren't even that interested in selling fresh fruit bunches anymore. They're interested in processing because that's where the money is. It's in the processed oil, not in the fresh fruit bunches. So so again, in Brazil, I think the way of overcoming this is one, by developing a more equitable relationship in sharing the benefits, literally the financial benefits between the farmers and the companies. But two, um, doing something more similar to what goes on in Peru and to a certain extent in other countries in Southeast Asia, and also in Colombia, which is to support the farmers to do their own processing, their own extraction of the oil, their own refinement, and then going straight to market with that. I think generally that's what I would say about that.
Well, good. Thanks, Andrew. And I don't see any more additional questions coming in. Um, it, just continuing on that line of discussion, though, it seemed that if there's also the risk, maybe I'm wrong here, that without small-scale processing infrastructure and aggregation and more value-added, of the value, more of the value chain coming back to the small holder, it would seem that with the processing in the hands of larger interests, there's also perhaps risk of over time market forces or other decisions favoring larger producers and of course non-agroforestry but monoculture producers. Is that potentially the case?
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree. That's actually what's to a certain extent going on in Brazil already, because of as I said in the very beginning of the presentation, because of the plummeting prices in the world market, and because of the economic recession in Brazil, a lot of these companies that were first really enthusiastic about expanding their operations and entering into a lot of agreements with farmers are actually now downscaling, downsizing, and some aren't even managing to meet the commitments that they had made with farmers. So this is exactly what's going on. What you projected is already happening in Brazil. Of course, it's very different from what's going on elsewhere, but there's different factors. But because of the national economy, political crisis, and all of that, and the wider market forces, the dropping prices, and the companies suddenly are pulling back, and this is actually an opportunity as well for the agroforestry systems, because the farmers who in the beginning just planted oil palm are kind of, some of them feel kind of stuck and are actually kind of desperate, don't really know what to do, and are turning to diversification. And this is actually what we want to do in our involvement in this project from here on, that is eCraft's involvement from here on, is to help farmers who already have a monocrop plantation to diversify to agroforestry systems, because their vulnerability because of this whole scenario I just described has increased. So the way of mitigating that to a certain extent is helping them to diversify.
Thank you. Well,
there seems to be another question here from.
Perhaps one last question.
There's a question from.
Perhaps one last question. Mario Silva's question. Can you see it there on the screen?
Yeah, I just saw it now. Is the project proposal developed to the point smallholders can obtain financing to implement it? Yes. There is financing for smallholders that can implement this sort of proposal. The problem with, as I said, with the rural credit system in Brazil anyhow, is that there's financing for oil palm, which will give you 80,000 reais, let's say around $25,000 for establishing the systems per hectare, but sorry, for not per hectare, for the overall systems, for the 6 hectare systems, but they are not designed. This credit financing isn't designed for agroforestry. It's not enough really for the agroforestry. It's only enough for the oil palm, for establishing the oil palm. And then on the other hand, you have credit that will pay for agroforestry, but it's not designed for the oil palm. So this is a change that needs to happen in the financing policies in Brazil, and I would say elsewhere too, is really designing lines of credit and financing that will allow you to do both in the same plot. And that will not only allow you under the rules, but also will be voluminous enough in funding per hectare to pay for these much more expensive systems, more expensive to implement, that is.
Very good. Thank you, Andrew, for that discussion and addressing those questions. It was a great presentation. I want to thank all of our participants who were with us today. And just a reminder, today's presentation has been recorded and will be posted on the agroforestryinaction.org website. And you can check that website for information on upcoming webinars, schedule, and recorded versions of all past webinars. So once again, thank you, Andrew, so much for being with us today, and forward to seeing everyone again next month with a presentation by Kathy Bukowski on forest farming practices and food forests here in the Northeast United States. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Great. Great. Thank you, Gregory. Thanks, everyone, for participating. And if you have any other doubts or questions, feel free to email me. And if I can't answer them, I'll make sure to direct you to other researchers involved who can. So feel free to contact me if you want.
Oh, yeah, good.
There goes my email.
Just to make sure that your email was visible to the participants, a.miccolis@cgiar.org. Follow up with Andrew. Thanks so much, Andrew.
Great. Thanks a lot, Gregory. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.